He dazzled the world in sequins, but lived in shadows. Liberace was America's showman, draped in diamonds, worshipped by millions, and forced to hide who he truly loved. This isn't gossip. It's the untold truth behind the glitter. Secret affairs, silent heartbreaks, and a legacy built on both brilliance and fear. Once you hear what fame cost him, you'll never see Liberace the same way again. Before the feathers, before the fame, he was just Wadzio. Born on May 16, 1919 in West Allis, Wisconsin, Wadzio Valentino Liberace entered the world to immigrant parents who lived paycheck to paycheck. His father, Salvatore, was a stern working-class Italian who played the French horn in local symphonies. His mother, Frances, a Polish-American factory worker, was a woman of dreams, tight-lipped but deeply proud. They lived modestly. No glitz, no glamour, just music and survival. Wadzio was a quiet, sensitive child, effeminate in a world that punished softness in boys. At school, he was mocked for his mannerisms. At home, he escaped into the family's upright piano. By the age of 4, he was playing entire sonatas by ear. By 7, he was performing on local stages. By 15, he had outgrown the teachers available to him in Milwaukee. Music was his escape, his armor, and eventually, his ticket out. His parents fought constantly, over money, over his future. But Wadzio clung to the keyboard like a lifeline. In 1939, he earned a scholarship to study at the Wisconsin College of Music. That same year, he made his first public debut with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. He was electric, effortless, and completely unforgettable. But even in those early days, something else began to form. A performance beyond the music. He would wink, smile, throw in a little flourish, a playful comment to the audience. And suddenly, people weren't just clapping, they were laughing, they were charmed. He realized he could be more than a pianist. He could be a personality. In the early 1940s, he started shifting from classical music to popular show tunes. He fused Rachmaninoff with Gershwin, Beethoven with ragtime. He played cocktail lounges, supper clubs, and finally, hotel ballrooms in Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Audiences couldn't get enough. In 1952, he launched the Liberace show on television. It was supposed to be small, local, but within months it was syndicated across America, reaching over 35 million viewers a week. He played piano, he told jokes, he smiled at the camera like it was an old friend, and America fell in love. But behind that perfectly sculpted smile was a boy from Wisconsin who still flinched at whispers, who still worried if his wrist moved too loosely, who still wore armor under every rhinestone cape, because he knew, the more they loved Liberace, the less they could ever know Wadzio. Hollywood in the 1950s was an empire built on illusion. Men were men, women were beautiful, and behind every star was a studio ready to silence anything that didn't fit the image. For Liberace, the stakes were even higher. He wasn't just popular, he was adored. His audience? Mostly middle-aged housewives, conservative families, and church-going Americans who sent him love letters by the thousands. They saw him as charming, safe, just a little flamboyant. But in the boardrooms of television sponsors and network executives, any whisper of homosexuality could mean cancellations, lawsuits, and boycotts. Liberace understood that, so he played the role. He smiled when asked why he wasn't married. He flirted with women on air. He invited his mother to interviews and gushed about his devotion to her. He learned how to speak without ever saying anything real. But the pressure was relentless. Every studio contract came with a morality clause. Every interview was vetted. Publicists told him how to sit, how to laugh, and even how to gesture less with his hands. Privately, he lived in fear. He told friends he wouldn't survive a scandal. One photo, he once told a confidant, and I lose everything. So he erased, hid, pretended. And every time someone asked him about the rumors, he sued. In 1956, a British tabloid called the Daily Mirror ran a now infamous column describing him as a deadly, winking, sniggering, snuggling, chromium-plated, scent-impregnated, luminous, quivering, giggling fruit. Liberace sued for libel and won. It wasn't about the money, it was survival. In the courtroom, he declared under oath, "I am against the practice of homosexuality and I lead a normal life." The public believed him, or maybe they wanted to. The show went on. But behind the velvet curtain, the real man was unraveling, because the more successful he became, the lonelier he was allowed to be. He was the first man Liberace truly let in. The first to share his bed, not just in body but in spirit, and the first to be erased. Jack Jarvis was a dancer, not famous, not rich, but magnetic. He met Liberace backstage at the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas around 1949. At the time, Lee was already on his rise, television appearances, sold-out shows, screaming fans. But Jack didn't scream, he smiled, soft, genuine, and Liberace noticed. They began quietly, weekend getaways, late-night dinners. Jack moved into one of Liberace's private guest houses just outside Los Angeles. He wasn't a secret, at least not at home. Lee lit up around him, said one of the house staff. He'd play little melodies for Jack that he didn't play for anyone else. For a while, it was real. Quiet, but real. They laughed, they slow danced, they even talked in whispers about buying a property together in Palm Springs, a place where no one would look twice. But reality came crashing in. As Liberace's fame ballooned, so did the scrutiny. Tabloid reporters, gossip columnists, suspicious photographers. Jack, young and in love, made a mistake. He showed up at one of Liberace's shows, uninvited, and tried to sit near the front. A photo was snapped, nothing scandalous, but close enough to raise eyebrows. Within 48 hours, Jack was gone. His belongings boxed, a check left on the nightstand, a contract drawn by Liberace's lawyers. The terms were clear: silence, forever. Jack never spoke to the press. He vanished from public life. Some say he moved to Santa Barbara and lived quietly as a florist. Others say he left the country entirely. Liberace never mentioned his name again. But in a private letter discovered years later, addressed only as J, Lee wrote, "You knew the music before I ever played a note, and I've never played the same since." By the mid-1970s, Liberace was not just a musician, he was an empire. And like any great empire, he wanted a legacy, a successor, someone to pass the sparkle to. That's when he met Vince Cardell. Vince was young, classically trained, strikingly handsome and humble. He played with passion, precision, and a quiet reverence that instantly captured Liberace's attention. What began as a professional mentorship quickly transformed into something far more intimate. Liberace brought Vince into his world. He moved him into his home, featured him in shows, and introduced him as his protégé. But behind closed doors, it was more than music. Vince was not just a lover, he was a mirror. Liberace began to style Vince to resemble a younger version of himself. He selected his outfits, orchestrated his public image, and even arranged for Vince to get dental work to match his signature Hollywood smile. He wanted to see himself again. Vince once said in a private interview, "It was love, but also something stranger. I was becoming him." Their performances together were mesmerizing. Matching pianos, matching tuxedos. Audiences saw chemistry. What they didn't see was the growing imbalance underneath. Vince began to lose his sense of self. The closer he got to Liberace, the more he disappeared. And then came the jealousy. If Vince garnered too much attention from fans or interviewers, Liberace would withdraw emotionally, sometimes even cancel his appearances. According to staff, arguments erupted over the smallest slights. Liberace needed total control over the show, over the story, over Vince. Eventually, it all unraveled. Vince wanted independence, creative freedom, a chance to be his own artist. Liberace refused. The breakup was quiet, but absolute. Vince was removed from the shows, the home, and the narrative, just like Jack Jarvis before him. But this time, something lingered longer. Years later, Vince released a tribute album dedicated to the man who made him a star. On the liner notes, he wrote, "He gave me everything but space to grow. I loved him, and I had to leave him." To the public, Liberace never commented on Vince again. But those who knew him say he kept a photo of the two of them at their twin pianos, in a drawer beneath silk scarves where no one could find it. If Liberace's earlier relationships lived in shadows, this one burned under a spotlight. Scott Thorson was just 18 when he met Liberace in 1976. A fresh-faced animal trainer from California, Scott was wide-eyed and impressionable. Everything Liberace adored. He was brought backstage at one of Lee's shows in Las Vegas through a mutual friend, and within weeks, he had moved into Liberace's mansion. To the world, Scott was introduced as Liberace's adopted son. In private, he was his lover. Their home was a fantasy world, chandeliers in the bathrooms, velvet-lined walls, a gold-plated hot tub. Scott was given furs, jewelry, cars, and full access to Liberace's extravagant lifestyle. But the most shocking gift came from a surgeon. Liberace paid for extensive plastic surgery to remodel Scott's face to match his own. Chin implants, nose reshaping, dental work. The transformation was meticulous. He wanted to preserve youth, Scott would later write. But more than that, he wanted to love a version of himself. The relationship, though full of spectacle, quickly spiraled into dysfunction. Scott became dependent on drugs, introduced, he claimed, to control his mood and appearance. Liberace grew more possessive, paranoid, and cold. Jealousy flared, fights erupted. Scott was isolated from friends and family. By 1982, after 5 tumultuous years, Scott left, but he didn't go quietly. He filed a palimony lawsuit against Liberace, demanding $113 million for breach of contract, emotional distress, and lost opportunities. Not every love left behind had a courtroom. Not every man asked to be remembered. Some slipped through the cracks of memory, tucked between show dates and stage lights. But they mattered. To Liberace, they all mattered. Billy Leatherwood was one of them. A flamboyant pianist with a sharp wit and a gift for mimicry, Billy joined Liberace on tour in Monte Carlo during the late 1970s. Audiences adored their chemistry. 2 grand pianos, 2 glittering jackets, 1 unstoppable rhythm. Behind the scenes, they shared hotel suites, quiet dinners, and the kind of laughter that only comes from real companionship. He made Lee laugh like a kid, said a crew member. That was rare. But Billy didn't want to be molded. He pushed back against the image management. He liked being loud, spontaneous, unpredictable. After one argument backstage, he was gone by morning. Some say he was offered a generous parting check. Others say he left on principle. Either way, he never performed with Lee again. Kerry James was different. A dancer, graceful, soft-spoken, and deeply private. He and Liberace met at a charity gala in Beverly Hills in the early 1960s. Their relationship was never public. It didn't need to be. They exchanged letters, met in secret, vacationed together in Europe, always under aliases. He never needed anything from Lee, said a close friend of Kerry's. He just wanted to be held, to be seen. Their connection lasted years, on and off, always in the margins. Kerry eventually moved on, found someone he could love without hiding. Then there were the unnamed, the studio assistants, the hotel bellboys, the makeup artists, drivers, waiters, men who spent a night, a weekend, maybe a few months orbiting the Liberace universe. Some were deeply infatuated. Others were just curious. Some never even knew who he really was until years later. Liberace kept meticulous records, gift receipts, hotel bills, sometimes handwritten notes. He cataloged love the way he cataloged antiques, to remember without needing to relive. In his Palm Springs home, tucked behind velvet drapes in a private sitting room, was a drawer filled with photographs. Most were unlabeled, just smiles, sunglasses, arms over shoulders, moments that couldn't exist in the real world. Because for all the men who passed through his life, only one rule held firm: they could never be seen. By the early 1980s, Liberace's body began to betray him. He had always been energetic, a blur of sequins and sound, but now he moved slower. His cheeks thinned, his suits once snug seemed loose across the shoulders. Rumors began to swirl. Was it cancer? Was it stress? Was it something worse? He denied everything, smiled through interviews, tapped the keys with practiced grace, but in private, he was falling apart. He was diagnosed with HIV in 1985, at a time when the disease was still called the gay plague by tabloids. To admit infection meant not only confirming his illness, but confirming his identity. And that, even as death approached, was a step he could not take. Only a handful of people knew the truth. A few doctors, a lawyer, and his long-trusted housekeeper. He continued to perform, his body weakening with each show. In his final appearances, his makeup was heavier, his movement minimal, but his voice, his smile, still golden. In late 1986, he collapsed at home. He was taken to Palm Springs Desert Hospital under a fake name. His team spun the story: liver failure, anemia, high blood pressure. No one used the word, not yet. Liberace died on February 4, 1987, at the age of 67. The official cause of death? Cardiac arrest due to pneumonia. But just days later, the coroner launched an investigation. The truth emerged. Liberace had died from complications related to AIDS. The press erupted. Headlines screamed betrayal. Some fans felt deceived. Others felt heartbroken. The man who had entertained them for decades, who had never admitted to being gay, who had sued anyone who dared suggest it, was suddenly a symbol of the very thing he had spent his life denying. Even in death, his estate tried to suppress the narrative. His publicist released cold, formal statements. His family refused interviews. The Liberace Foundation focused on his musical legacy, not his truth. But for many in the LGBTQ+ community, something else was happening. Liberace's death forced a conversation. It broke the silence. Here was one of the most famous men in the world, a man who could afford to hide, taken by a disease that had already claimed thousands who couldn't. His story became part of the cultural reckoning. Not a villain, not a hero. Just a man who had lived, loved, and lied, because the world gave him no other choice. Liberace never called himself a pioneer. He didn't march. He didn't protest. He didn't stand at a podium and shout, "This is who I am." But still, he changed everything. He was one of the first entertainers to blend classical music with Las Vegas flair, to turn a piano recital into a stage spectacle. He made rhinestones respectable, made excess an art form, and made audiences of millions laugh, cry, and believe. And whether he meant to or not, he cracked open the door for generations of queer performers who followed. Elton John called him a hero. Lady Gaga drew from his aesthetic. RuPaul named him a founding icon of queer visibility, even in denial. Because even in silence, Liberace showed us something. That a man could be flamboyant, soft-spoken, dazzling, and powerful. That masculinity didn't have to be loud to be strong. That identity, no matter how hidden, still leaves a mark. In 2013, HBO's Behind the Candelabra brought his story back into the spotlight. Michael Douglas portrayed him not just as a performer, but as a man. Complicated, closeted, fiercely loving, and deeply afraid. Audiences saw what the 1950s never could. That Liberace wasn't a punchline. He was a love story, a tragedy, a warning, and a triumph. His museum may have closed, his foundation may have shifted focus, but his legacy lives in glitter and grace. Every time a drag queen dons a cape, every time a queer artist stands in rhinestones and refuses to apologize, every time someone dares to sparkle in a world that demands quiet, Liberace is there. Not just at the piano, but in the act of shining anyway. He wore sequins to survive. He smiled to protect his truth. He hid his love in shadows and died before he could ever speak it aloud. But now, we speak it for him. Waju Valentino Liberace wasn't just a showman. He was a man who lived a brilliant lie, because the world refused to let him live in honest truth. If his story moved you, don't let it end here. Like, comment, subscribe to LGBTQ+ vibes, because these aren't just stories, they're echoes of lives lived in silence and finally heard. And next time, we're stepping into the hidden world of another Hollywood legend, whose secrets may shock you even more. Until then, keep shining, even when the world tells you not to.